Afternoon, everyone. I'll just give folks a little time to file in and we'll get started. So thank you so much for joining this special lunchtime chat. Okay. So welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Yves Remy. I am the director at the Sridas Ramphal Center here at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. And I'd just like to welcome you all to this special lunchtime chat hosted in collaboration with the Barbados UNCTAD 15 Coordinating Committee. Today we're discussing a topic that the SRC has been, I would say, at the forefront in thinking in terms of its relevance to trade, under a provocative title, The Battle for Climate Change Finance, the role of redefining vulnerability. Now, vulnerability is not a new word for those of us in this space. It's being used quite a lot, and Barbados and other Caribbean countries have actually been using it to claim special status in accessing financing from the international community. To support their claim for special treatment, many international organizations have been assisting with the creation of what we call vulnerability indices. And these are really indicators drawn across economic, environmental, and sometimes social or institutional metrics to assess countries' relative susceptibility across certain criteria. Now, there's no agreement as to which metrics should be chosen or how vulnerability stands to be really measured. But there is, especially in recent times, due to the work of these institutions, some convergence around at least two sets of metrics: the economic vulnerability proxies and the environmental proxies. And in the case of the latter, the environmental proxies, climate change and its effects on the Caribbean region mean that CARICOM states have some claim to particular vulnerabilities that might support their claim that they should have special attention given in terms of the prioritization of financing by international organizations. UNCTAD 15 this year is being held in Barbados under the theme From Vulnerability and Inequality to Prosperity for All. Being in Barbados, where Prime Minister Motley has been one of the standard bearers for vulnerability, we could not let the occasion pass without offering the opportunity for a unique Caribbean and perhaps even Barbadian perspective on how to use the vulnerability criteria to promote Caribbean advocacy in this space. So for the next hour, it is my honor to welcome Professor Avinash Persaud, Barbadian Prime Minister Motley's Special Envoy on Investment and Financial Services. Professor Avinash Persaud's career spans finance, public policy, and academia. He's Emeritus Professor at Gresham College and an advisor to governments on financial policy. He was a former senior executive at GAM London, State Street, JP Morgan, and UBS. He currently serves as chairman of the CARICOM Commission on the Economy, and I believe we've previously hosted him in his capacity as chairman at the SRC. He has been chairman of the Regulatory Subcommittee of the UN Commission on Financial Reform and chairman of the Warwick Commission on International Finance Reform. And there are many other parts of his bio that would just be too voluminous for me to read everything. So I have invited Professor Persaud to speak on this topic for about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we will open up the floor to interrogation by the audience on his thoughts, as well as in my special role as moderator on topics that I think might be illuminating. So Professor Persaud, I'm handing over the floor to you. Welcome and good luck with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. It's a real pleasure to be here at the SRC luncheon. It's also an opportunity for me to thank you and to congratulate you for becoming director of the center. My father, as some of you know, was Sir Sridhar's right-hand person on economics and worked very closely with him. So the center and its future and progress has always been very dear to my heart. And indeed, the two of them work very closely on bringing the idea of vulnerability to small states, to the international arena as early as the late 1980s, commissioning some of the first reports on vulnerability of small states. So this is a topic dear to me as well. I'd much prefer having a conversation with your audience, Genevieve, and with this in this webinar. So I'm not going to speak for very long. I think I want to set out three alternative vistas of a fairly familiar landscape, that of issues around climate change. And then let's open it up to a wider discussion. The first one is, the first vista is a different perspective on why we've not made great progress on climate change so far. And I'm reminded, so there's lots of sound and fury, there's lots of activism. I'm here in London at the moment, ahead of the COP26 conference in Glasgow. There are activists on the streets blocking roads, and so there's much focus on climate change, but not much progress. When I think about this topic, I'm reminded of a book that really had a big impact on me by Siddhartha Mukherjee, called The Emperor of Maladies. It's a biography of cancer. And Siddhartha is a doctor, oncologist, and had this really interesting perspective. He goes through the history of cancer, right down to finding cancer in some of the Egyptian mummies, and talks about how surgeons first approached cancer, thinking that the solution was to cut it all out, thinking of how the chemists first approached cancer, thinking of different chemicals for the chemotherapy. And then he reaches his conclusion that the magic cure for cancer has not been medicine. The magic cure for cancer has been prevention, has been public policy, has been stopping people smoking, for instance. What has brought lung cancer down has not been new drugs, it's been taxes and bans, very high taxes and blanket bans. And I think that there are strong similarities with a lot of issues, of which climate change is one. The problem of climate change is not a technical issue. There is, in fact, this week, a new factory opening up in Iceland. Genevieve, you may have come across it, which is a factory that eats carbon, or to be fair, captures carbon and deposits it deep into the ground. So we have the technical ability to reverse climate change. It's not about our technical capability. It's not about people not understanding that climate change is important. It's not about ordinary people not getting it, that climate change is something that matters to them. It's really about who's going to pay for it and who's going to pay for addressing an issue that may be impacting other people more than them. Like all of the fundamental challenges facing humanity, at the core, it's an issue of equity rather than technical solutions. And I think you can see that by the way the problem of climate change is often framed. How often have we seen tables or charts, often pie charts, or even just narratives of the total amount of carbon emissions in a year, metric tons by country? Top of the list is China. Number 2 is the US. Third is India. And then the narrative goes on that we can't solve climate change without clamping down on emissions in China and India. We need to stop them producing, stop them burning coal, etc. But here's another frame. Let's look at emissions, metric tons of carbon per capita, per head of population. And then you see the US becomes at the top. And indeed, China and India are way down. The US per capita, carbon per head of the population, produces twice as much as China and maybe 3 times as much as India. So when the activists say that we should freeze emissions today, should we freeze in that the average American produces 3 times more carbon than the average Chinese person or the average Indian? Let me propose another way of framing it. Because why are greenhouse gases a problem for us? It's a problem because they stay up in the atmosphere. We keep on adding it every year. If they went up and then expired after a short period of time, then this would be less of a problem. So what matters is the stock of greenhouse gases. So now let's look at a table of the stock of greenhouse gases, of carbon emitted by countries, the stock, so their history. Then America is there over 10-fold greater than China, or 20-fold greater than India. So what is the right way of framing? All the differences there is about issues of equity. We're not going to solve climate change unless we have a solution as if equity matters. We need to have a solution for climate change as if equity matters. And if we don't, we're not going to solve it. And saying, for instance, let's stop the burning of coal, and that's all, that singular slogan, a powerful slogan, that's not dealing with climate change as if equity matters. And if that's all we do, it's not going to work. If we instead think about other things we can do in addition to that, or mitigations we can have for the developing world, then that may work. But that's not on the table. And we shouldn't be surprised. The UK is hosting COP26 this year. Lots of efforts by the COP president, Alok Sharma. So really heartfelt, genuine efforts. But I don't think the UK government really wants to make a major change. They don't have a path. They don't have a plan for how the UK is going to go to net zero. How can they then have a plan for how the world is going to go to net zero? And how we're going to deal with the equity problem? So we need to solve the equity problem. And unless we do, we're not going to solve climate change. And so 1.5 degrees is lost. The amount of resources that are going to go towards adaptation is not going to be enough because we haven't got that political settlement, that political solution that deals with climate change as if equity matters. Let me talk about my second vista on the world, because I think the activists do us a bit of a disservice when they try to raise climate change as an issue that impacts us all. It does impact us all. It will impact us all. But it impacts different people a different amount at different times. There are parts of the world that over the next 20 years will benefit from climate change, where the growing season will widen, where they become habitable, where routes become crossable, which have never been crossed before. And those places are not agitating heavily against climate change. There is a part of the world that is on the front line of climate change. And that is the world that lies between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. The tropics of Cancer and Capricorn determine where, because the Earth doesn't move in a steady way around its axis, the equator moves where the heat of the sun moves within that range. And that is the area of the Earth that is the hottest, where where temperatures have increased them in the most intolerable ways and will continue to do so. It's also around the middle of the Earth, and that's where sea levels are increasing the most. As a humble economist, I didn't really get the science that when the polar ice caps melt, sea levels don't rise at the poles. If anything, sea levels falling at the poles because the weight of those ice caps is reducing and land is rising. That water, because of the spin of the Earth, finds its way at the equator. So between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, we have both the biggest intolerable increases of temperature and the highest increases in sea level. Both are leading to a deadly combination of wetter hurricanes, longer droughts, increased locust plagues, and in Africa, we have also an increase in dengue and yellow fever and other diseases that come with these extremes of heat. There is a front line on climate change, a front line that is experiencing it far more than other places. And I think that in a world in which we're not going to address climate change fast enough because there's no political settlement, when there's a fight for scarce resources, we need to stake our claim on the fact that there is a front line on climate change and we are in the middle of that climate change. We need to form new partnerships, new constellation of allies around the front line. And this is a front line that has small countries and big countries, mainly developing countries, but some rich, some poor. This is a new set of allies. Now, I feel very passionate about this because many of our people have spent the last 20, 30 years trying to define the role of SIDS, small island development states, trying to make SIDS seem to be a grouping that is especially deserving. And when my father and Sir Shuriat were working on this back in the 1980s, the multilateralism was at a high. And so the notion that there are other parts of the world we need to consider was widely accepted. Today, multilateralism is at a low. Any grouping of small developing states is not considered powerful, is not considered potent, is largely ignored. So we need to form new groupings because the existing grouping is not a grouping that will get people to do anything more than add an extra line to their speech. It's not a line, it is not a grouping that causes them to really make a difference in terms of resources. Arguing that in a world of scarce resources, the front line needs to get resources for investing in adaptation is a much more powerful argument. And before I move on to my final vista, let me say it's a powerful argument for climate change. It's a powerful argument for the frontline states. It's also a powerful argument for the world. The world is suffering from a lack of investment. We're about to have a serious issue where now that the pandemic is easing in terms of deaths, that we've got vaccinations out there, the stimulus from governments is now coming down. Governments are getting concerned about their public debt levels. And when the stimulus from the pandemic begins to taper away, what you're going to be left with is a world that is saving too much. Private savings are too high. There's an absence of investment. Investing for climate change, investing for adaptation of climate change is actually what the world needs. And let me turn to my final point. If we can persuade the world that the front line needs investment for adaptation, one thing that will appeal to them is that the northern countries, the developed countries, is that their technologies will be used. They like the idea of lending to developing countries in order for us to buy their technologies. Who are the largest companies in the world of solar technology, in wind power technologies? It's largely the Western developed economies and now China as well. And I think that I think that is going to perhaps be the quid pro quo for getting concessionary funding to the developing world. But we live in a world where ownership matters. We used to think back 30, 40 years ago that all we needed to do was educate our public. And what we've learned after 40, 50 years is public education is important. Education, education, education. It's vitally important. But ownership also matters. And the new ownership is ownership of knowledge, ownership of intellectual property. And so if all the intellectual property of the new renewable energies technologies are in one place, those places are going to do well in this development race. And yet we have some unique advantages. in acquiring some of that ownership and knowledge. We are on the front line. I remember when I had the privilege of being involved in Dominica in that tragic situation where it was trying to rescue itself from Maria. And we went along and Dominica declared it was going to be the world's first climate resilient nation. And we went along speaking to the world's leading research institutes on climate change. And we found they didn't know as much as the average Dominican knew, because the average Dominican had experienced it. Their crops had been ripped from the soil. Their roofs and solar panels had been shattered. And they understood what was possible and what was not. And so we have this advantage in being here that we need to create, we need to cement, we need to create research institutes on how we adapt to climate change. And we will have this unique position of that we have to adapt to it. We are adapting to it. And so I think that we need to build that into a knowledge that we own, an intellectual property that we own, that we export, that we encourage research, and we partner with research to develop that and to build that into an export of knowledge. Let me wrap up here and ask you for your thoughts and questions. We are living in a world where we haven't reached a political settlement on how we solve climate change, where the people who've contributed most to the stock of carbon and continue to do so are not the ones who are suffering on the front line. And that imbalance means that will continue to happen. And therefore 1.5 degrees is probably lost. The amount of resources put towards adaptation is not enough. And we need to find a way of claiming a greater stake in limited resources. And I don't think we're going to do that by saying to the world, we are small island development states. I think we will do that by forming allies and coalitions with those on the front line of climate change. And we need to use that being on the front line to create knowledge, expertise, and intellectual property on how the world adapts to something that we will all face, all of us, everywhere in the world, adapt to a world of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Avi. I think you managed to turn so many of the assumptions and the narrative so far, at least the way we've been spawning it in the Caribbean, on its head. I'd venture to say, and you can stop me if I'm wrong. One of the things is it's not a technical, scientific problem. It's a political problem. And going even deeper, it's an equity problem. The traditional nomenclature around which we are rallying in this debate of SIDS is perhaps not the only, or certainly not the singular, or maybe not the right way to package the issue in advocacy terms. That's another big one that I suspect people probably took a little bit of a heavy inward breath when you said that. And then the third sort of pillar of your speech was, we need to think about it more in terms of ownership of IP relating to adaptation, so that the technology getting ahead, and recasting the whole story around climate change to fit a frontline narrative. We're on the front line, and that transcends just SIDS issues. That's also some of the developed countries. I think lots of food for thought there, and it didn't escape me, I'm certainly not the audience, that in the title we thought we were going to be talking about a vulnerability index. So I wonder if, implicit in how you're packaging or repackaging the issue is that all of that work, technical work that has been done in vulnerability indices, is maybe the time has passed for it? Is it that we can still employ vulnerability indices, but in a different way? I'd like to have your thoughts on that, and I will get to the questions from the audience. But I just also wanted you, in the context of this being an UNCTAD 15 time in Barbados, where we're really getting to the topic of how does trade contribute to any of these discussions? I mean, I know you said we need to bring it back to the politics and the equity and morality, I would dare say, of politics. So how do we center that in a context of sort of a trade negotiation or a trade discussion that's happening now in Barbados? Do you have any thoughts about how that becomes front and center? That's my prerogative as moderator, to put these questions to you, and then I'll turn very quickly to the questions by the audience.
Well, I think that one of the challenges we have with traditional ways of thinking about vulnerability is that the statisticians, by their nature, look at historic data. And yet we're talking about a vulnerability that's increasing into the future. So any measure of vulnerability that's based on historic data, and I say this as an economist, economists like to, their data doesn't tend to be always the most up to date. So it's not only historic, it's perhaps even old, is going to underestimate the issue of climate change. I think that I think that's one of the first challenges. I think that one of the things we observe too is that the vulnerability of small island development states is a vulnerability of adapting to a world that is forever, our external frontier is forever changing. And you find that that vulnerability is almost constant no matter what crisis we're facing. So if you looked at our vulnerability to 9/11, our vulnerability to the global financial crisis, our vulnerability to the pandemic, our vulnerability to climate change, you find we have very similar vulnerabilities. And therefore, were we to get one set of vulnerabilities that captures the world's imagination, I think you will find that our other vulnerabilities will actually transcend that, will be there as well, implicitly. So I think that if we want to capture the current focus and imagination on climate change, then I would focus in on vulnerability to climate change by looking at two scientific objective things that can be measured in real time too. I developed a number of indices that became quite popular beyond my wildest dreams, something called the EMU calculator and the risk appetite index. And what people loved about it, which I hadn't planned initially, was that it could be real time. People like indices that change. People like to say, well, there was an earthquake here. How has it changed the index today? Not how did it change the index last year? And so I think if we were to come up with a vulnerability to climate change based on sea levels and temperature levels, you would have a ranking that could be changing on a regular basis, frequent basis, and will show the steady increase in vulnerability. You have something objective that will allow the donor countries to say, right, we're putting an increasing share of our resources to those countries on the front line as measured by these objective scientific things. You talked about trade, and we are on the verge of UNCTAD, and we know as small developing states, trade is critical. We are extremely open. One of the ways of rebranding small island development states that I like to use is to say that we are hyper open economies. If you add our imports and exports together as a percent of GDP, we're more open than most countries. Now, people want to be hyper open. Nobody wants to be a small island development state. So it's a kind of branding that puts us into a place that people want to be. But that means that we need to think about how is trade impacted by climate change. People talk about food security. I'm more concerned about nutrition security. That's linking less to climate change, more to our explosion of non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart problems. I think that my final point on IP, I think, is very relevant to the whole trade discussion. It's hard for some of our people to not think of trade in ways other than boats and airplanes and cargo and packages. The new trade in the world is trade in weightless products or weightless goods that comes down a broadband. And part of that is knowledge. So the new world in which so I think the way we think about trade is that we need to be exporting knowledge. And what is that knowledge that the world needs? The knowledge to adapt to climate change.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. Now we have a whole half hour where I'm going to just read out questions from the audience. Oftentimes in these webinars, we don't get to really what the burning questions of the audience members are. And I'm happy to say we have half an hour. So I'm going to sort of troll through the questions and gather them together where there's similar thoughts, and you can read them as well. So we have some comments. If you look at the Q&A tab, I think I saw a question, not seeing it anymore, by Joe Edgell saying, how do we really tell our story of this equity and being on the front lines? What's the new way that we can tell that story? And I'm gonna lump that together with Mohamed Najee's question, which is, at the global level, how can we persuade the world that equity matters in solving climate change? And where do we start? Beyond equity is accountability. How do we convince major emitters to provide the finance and investments, especially to SID? So that's one question. Another question that we have is from Professor Jessica Byron Reed, where she says, so you suggest that the trade-off will be that we recycle climate change finance by buying adaptation technology mostly from the North. There's no doubt the case that many good technologies out there are from the North, but what of South-South cooperation, the many very ingenious, appropriate, and sustainable technologies that can be learned and exchanged with our Southern actors? A number of Southern countries have made great advances in low-cost, effective, adaptive technologies. Where should the balance be in this? So she argues that South-South cooperation should not be shunted aside in this process. And I'm sure you were not even suggesting that, but I wonder if you have any comments on these two sets of questions. And then
quite varied, and as I'm much older than you, Genevieve, I may not be able to hold all this into my head at the same time. So do prod me. But I would say that firstly, I don't think there's a trade-off here. We can do all of these things. In no way are we saying we're going to shun South-South cooperation or trying to build our own. I mean, when I talk about IP, that's essentially us trying to build our own products based on this front line knowledge that we have that others don't have. And we can be building that with our partners and our allies who are also on the front line, and also other global southern countries. So IP does not need to be other people's IP. It's about building ours and having allies. It is just that if you need some of the infrastructure that we need, some of the major infrastructure and the large amounts of money, is we're not going to get that from our southern allies. We're going to get that from donors who will want something back. And what they'll want will be us using their technologies. I'm not saying that's a desirable way of the world, but that is the way. And we need to be aware of that, in addition to forging as many South-South relationships we can. One of the African export investment banks were visiting Barbados as part of UNCTAD yesterday, and we've just signed an MOU with them. So promoting more South-South trade with Africa in particular, and where there are technologies on climate change, definitely. Now, in terms of how do we tell that story, I think that's the story we need to tell. We need to tell a story that we're on the front line. We need to tell the story of what because that's not, we need to tell a story that's not, see, a SID story to me is a story people can ignore. A frontline to climate change story is a story they cannot ignore. The world can get by.
Why is that, Avinash? Why is
because
it?
Because 98% of the world population does not live in a SID, but 100% of the world will soon have to adapt to climate change.
So then everybody's on the front line, in a sense. So then how is that a distinguishing argument?
Because they're not on the front line now. Because we can say, we are on the front line now. You will be in 20 years' time. Our knowledge, expertise that we have today is going to be relevant to you. But if we say to you, we're a SID, our knowledge and expertise is not relevant to you. Is not relevant to the rest of the world.
I hear that, and there's part of me, and I think there's a similar question by Eisenhower Douglas, who says, given that CARICOM countries are mainly SIDS, can you redefine or define the implications of your current thesis on climate change for those countries? I think that's one part of it, but equally, I'm a little bit torn. If it is an equity argument that you're suggesting that we need to win, equity argument or war that we need to wage.
No.
Let me finish. if it is that the argument is one that breaks down at the end of the day into one of equity, and it is the case that right now SIDS are on the front line. SIDS are on the front line. That's not debatable. How is it that recasting it as a frontline argument is somehow going to change minds and hearts, as opposed to a SIDS argument, if the two things kind of converge anyway? That's the first one. And aren't we meant to be encouraging empathy among, isn't that the message of PM Motley? Isn't it? Doesn't she always appeal to the morality of the world? That's what she did at the last UN General Assembly meeting. So yes, I agree with you that we have to make it into an argument that everybody can kind of feel and ultimately feel almost personally affected by. But that doesn't gel so well with the argument that it is a moral argument, and sometimes the world just has to do what is in the best interest of others, even if they're not affected by it immediately. And by the way, they are, because of all the things we're seeing in Germany and in New York. So I mean, I'm giving you a lot of different things here, but I'm trying to understand how to make the argument.
Okay, so I'm not saying we need to make an equity argument. I'm saying that equity is why we do not have a settlement on climate change, because it is an equity issue. And that's why, so I'm saying that's why we don't have a settlement, and that's why we're not going to get enough resources. And that's why fighting for what limited resources there are is very important. Now, what I'm saying is, in that fight for limited resources, what is the thing that gives us edge and power in that fight? Saying that we are on the front line gives us edge and power because that front line is going to move and it's relevant to everybody. Pointing out that we are learning things being on this front line, what we're experiencing being on this front line, is something that's useful to the world. And how we adapt and succeed in adapting is useful to the world, is a way in which we're going to fight and get a better claim for resources. There's limited resources today. That front line is not just small island development states. That front line also includes developing states that are not islands. In Africa, so the Caribbean is suffering from wetter, more destructive hurricanes, but sub-Saharan Africa is suffering tremendously from being on the front line in terms of droughts and locusts and illnesses that are increasing. They're also on the front line, but experiencing something else. So I'm talking about a group of allies that are much bigger than small island states, bigger in terms of numbers and quantity and force, and a much more powerful group. Powerful in terms of numbers, in terms of population, but also powerful in terms of relevance.
And Professor Persaud, tell me why and how come vulnerability and the index there doesn't get us there as well, because the vulnerability index doesn't just unearth SIDS as being vulnerable. It has a number of different sort of metrics. And so in a sense, that pathway has already been forged and would take us there. But let me just, that's the first question. I know you said you have a limited capacity to remember, but you're doing well. So Jermaine Beckford has an interesting counter.
But do you want me to argue on you want me to talk to you about vulnerability, or
I do.
Get Jermaine's question first?
Well, let me get Jermaine's, and then you can get back to mine, because I want to privilege the audience. So Jermaine Beckford says, for many years, the West has disappointed the rest of the world on the issue of climate change. We have attended summit after summit to no resolve. Money alone will not solve the issue of climate change and the ravages and effects on the region. As a region, are we not in a better position if we completely ditch the West and approach both India and China for strategic alliances and financing on these issues?
Well, I mean, I don't. So my equity argument is why the world has not done enough. And in that argument, we can forge as many allies as we can. And indeed, India is in between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. A big chunk of China is too. They suddenly become allies in the front line. A big part of India and China are part of the front line. Not all of those countries, not all of Africa is on the front line. But the nice thing about this reconfiguration of the front line is it basically is a significant, powerful group of the global southern countries, including India and China. And China in particular, India to some extent as well, is, to the earlier question, doing some interesting development of technologies that we can learn from. But ultimately, we need to be developing our own technologies. And so maybe we enter into partnerships with leading universities in China and India and elsewhere in developing new adaptive technologies to climate change. Get an expertise and an IP in that area that we could then export. Shall I come to your point on vulnerability?
You shall. I just wanted to register. I just on that point of IP and sort of these joint ventures, I just wanted to register a comment by Dr. Tymoon Stewart. She agrees with you that you make a very important point, that we know more about the effects of climate change than most because we are on the front line. And therefore, she's suggesting that we should be in a position to develop these technologies and export them. And she questions whether we are savvy enough to protect our knowledge by registering IP in what is being developed, and whether education shouldn't play a greater role in that sort of protection and sensitization move. But so I just wanted to acknowledge her comment.
Can I add a comment to that?
No, but can I add a comment to that? On Dr. Stewart's comment, absolutely.
I think that's an important role for you at the SRC to play, and our other trade specialists in the region. We have a powerful set of trade specialists in the region, and we have some leading figures of some of your colleagues and people you worked with before, like Pamela Coke-Hamilton, now running the ITC. The WTO head is a friend of the Caribbean. We have a very powerful group at CARICOM leading on negotiations on trade. And they have been trying to get our region to be investing more and registering our IP more. So yes, we need to do more. And I think let me give you that baton to play.
Yes.
So we're going to go back to vulnerability indices.
We're going to go back to why is the vehicle that has been put forward and finessed and a lot of money and resources paid to it, why is that index not sufficient to get to the same class of frontliners on vulnerability, whether it's climate change or more broadly trade? Why isn't that a vehicle that we could all support?
So there are two reasons why it hasn't proven to be. And the first one is that we're talking about a future-oriented risk that is increasing exponentially with time. When statisticians start looking at creating vulnerability indices, they like to have long histories, time series of data. And so the vast majority of the period of their data will not include our vulnerability to climate change. And therefore, there's a problem with it picking up that vulnerability. Secondly, one of the fashions in the vulnerability world is saying, can I come up with one number that captures all of these vulnerabilities? And what we have seen is that attempts to do that, as we add more and more things, they are vulnerabilities to economic shocks, vulnerabilities to social shocks, to political shocks, to trade shocks, to climate change shocks. And you add more and more of these shocks, it seems like we're getting to something interesting and composite. Firstly, it's actually very hard to interpret. But secondly, as we add more, we have found that it ends up converging to GDP, because gross domestic product is a kind of composite of the world economy. And so it doesn't change our call for more resources when we go in front of multilateral agencies, because they're currently using GDP. And of course, the Caribbean countries are not the poorest countries in the world. And many of the countries on the front line for climate change, some of them are, but not all of them are the poorest countries in the world. And so they don't benefit from a GDP-focused priority of funds or a multivariable approach to vulnerability, which is converging to GDP. So that is why there's some useful work being done. We should continue to look at work being done, but coming up with a composite index based on historical measures of a wide variety of things is not capturing this exponentially increasing future risk on one thing that is very different than our GDP.
Well, I just read somewhere yesterday that the new president of Guyana had just supported the creation of a universal index. So I suspect there's a lot to be resolved in the internal camp when it comes to how the utility of a UVI, MVI in putting forward the Caribbean case. But I'm going to leave that because it's steeped in a lot of disagreement, I suspect, at that level.
But I think it's very important for your audiences to know that in some of the measures of these universal indices, which are very appealing conceptually, it's very appealing, but the lowest ranked, the most vulnerable ranked Caribbean country in these ranks come in around number 50. And some of them, like Barbados, come in above 100. In other words, they are 50 countries more vulnerable than our most vulnerable country. Now, if you want to get a greater claim of financial resources in the world, saying to people that there are 50 worse off countries than you is not the way to go.
Yes, I've heard you make that argument, and it does have a force to it, and it's something that I think will be and has been sort of contended with. I see another question, but I don't want, there's an anonymous attendee whose question I don't want us to lose sight of, which is this idea of this carbon credit system. So his question or her question is, do you have any thoughts about the effectiveness of carbon credits and the wisdom of participating in that market as a viable climate change solution? And that comes in the wake of a recently released scheme by the European Union of the CBAM, so Carbon Border Adjustment Measures, which is a unilateral measure, a unilateral program that the EU is threatening to unleash, has gotten a lot of interesting feedback by the world community, has not really been assessed yet, although it's been debating at the WTO for its WTO consistency. So what we're finding more and more is that in the absence of a global trade solution to climate change, more and more countries are just unilaterally imposing either carbon credit systems, trade emissions schemes, border adjustment schemes, carbon taxes. Nothing really coming out of CARICOM. I don't know if it's at the level of discussion, but nothing really as yet on carbon credits or carbon taxes. I wonder if you have any ideas about where the Caribbean region should go when it comes to disciplining, from a trade perspective, the use of carbon.
I think that given our size, that we're always going to be a follower than a setter in this space, because we want there to be a convergence to one or two type of schemes that have universal application. And then we'd want to be able to use them to support investment in carbon capture or in renewable type energies that are replacing carbon. I think that, again, being small, there's a limited role we can play in these markets unless we can find ways of including blue carbon, because we are large when we think about our sea areas, our ocean areas. And so we should be looking at those types of carbon mechanisms where there's greatest potential to include the ability of the oceans to capture carbon. Those will be the ones we should probably favor and support and encourage.
Thanks for that. I have two more questions. We have a good 10, 11 minutes left, so I'm going to pose them. One is by Darcy Boyce. To what extent are the countries not on the front line of climate change invested in the assets at risk in the states that are on the front line? Who are these investors? Can we use those interests to get more attention and results in adaptation programs in the current frontline areas? With which other institutional groups should we form alliances to get more effective focus on climate effects in the areas that are currently most at risk.
So I don't think that there is a large amount of private sector investment in the frontline countries from the external side. But that's a great question for us to look at. My hunch is that a bigger segment is those people who want to invest in climate adaptation. So some $1 trillion of assets has in pension plans around the world, mainly from the developed north, have said that they want to use their $1 trillion of assets to be investing in things that are related to climate change resilience and adaptation and mitigation. So one of the things that we're trying to do at CARICOM is come up with a way of ranking investments based on their climate resilience. They're based on their climate resilience as an individual investment and how that individual investment impacts the resilience of the country as a whole, or maybe even the region. And if we can develop that kind of index or measure or ranking, then it will allow us to tap that huge amount of investment, that 1 trillion, that wants to invest in those things. So at the moment, and this has happened very rapidly. When COP20 came about, there was a shortage of money and investment in climate resilient stuff. Today, there's money saying, I'm ready to, but I can't find the projects. I can't find the new interesting projects that will make a difference. So the shortage is us coming up with stories, objective stories and rankings of things we need to do to show the world that this will impact climate adaptability. And if that's what you want to invest in, this is something for you to invest in.
Okay, so there are 3 more questions. It's getting quite broad. I mean, usually at these meetings, there's an attrition rate. There's, people leaving, but I think people still want to hear. So I'm gonna fully take on our remaining 8 minutes. So this is getting a little bit wider. Dr. Stewart says, I'm currently interviewing the business sector in several CARICOM countries on their approaches to sustainability practices, and have been told, among other factors, that awareness is not as good as it could be and hoped, and also that given the financial crunch, businesses cannot invest in sustainable practices because they have to pass on that cost to consumers who cannot currently absorb the costs. So the situation is difficult. How do we balance a financial crisis with the need to adopt sustainable practices?
I think the answer to that relates to the answer to the last question, because the balance sheets of governments in our region are too small for all of the sustainability investment we need to do. Whatever the precise numbers are, we don't know the precise numbers, but what we know for certain is the amount that we need to invest in sustainability is greater than the amount the governments have space to invest. Therefore, we need to employ the private sector. Now, the private sector has savings in our region. It's not just at the corporate level. So we need to employ the local private sector, which has savings of around 75 billion US dollars. And we need to employ the savings of the international private sector that wants to invest in sustainability, the 1 trillion. So how do we do that? So I think that's what we're trying to find ways of firstly identifying what are projects that objectively support sustainability, are resilient to climate change, and improve the country's resilience. Let's identify those projects first. Some of them governments will have to invest in because the private sector will not be interested. There isn't a clear return. Some of them the private sector will invest in, get a return, and also be able to tick the box that they are doing sustainability, which is what they've told their savings that they're doing, and their savings want to see.
And such an important part of this is the role of the diaspora and how we are engaging them to invest in these climate sustainable savvy types of investments, because there's a whole there's a captive audience out there in the diaspora to do that kind of investing. I'm not sure we're finding I'm sure you have an opinion on this, Avi, but I'm not sure we're finding the right ways to encourage the private sector or utilize the resources that they have in these kinds of sustainable activities. I wonder if Barbados has done anything recently or is spearheading anything in that area of targeting the diaspora that you might be aware of for sustainability and green types of investments.
Well, we talk about the diaspora a lot, and the question is, how have we moved that along? There's a fair amount of interest, we know, because of the amount of remittances we get, which are still quite significant for the region. So that means that people sending money back, primarily to their families, but they have a connection. So can we introduce more instruments? We've been talking about this for a very long time. I'm a big believer in revealed preference. So for some reason, they haven't shown that interest and people haven't been able to sell them an interest. So whilst we need to continue doing that, there are some interesting new websites, things like there's one called Home Strings, where for people interested in investing back home, they will show a range of different projects going on that they could invest in. But for some reason, these things don't pick up. So yes, we should do those. We've got some crowd financing instruments coming up. You've seen the one in Barbados, Carry Lend. Maybe they can be pitching themselves to the diaspora. But I think that the low-hanging fruit, to be honest, Genevieve, is the $1 trillion that has declared that they want to invest in sustainability and they can't find it. We're on the front line. We can say, do you want to invest? Do you really want to invest in sustainability? You really want to do that? Here's your proof that you really want to do that. Invest in the front line and make it adaptable and sustainable.
That's a wonderful way to end off. I have another question from one of my students, past students, talking about the ND, and it's just unfortunately written to the panelists, which is, you think the nationally determined commitments of Caribbean countries should be used aggressively to attain financing for green technologies. So we use sort of our statement to the world as a sort of a carrot to draw them in. And I just wanted to reflect two more comments. Is one, the African states, the recently held summit, is that an opportunity for us to really go beyond words and find ways of working more closely with these countries in order to promote our interests on the front line, I imagine, but also that South-South cooperation. And there's a last question from Ralph Luther, which is, he said he joined late, so if the question has been asked, would a project like the recently launched Barbados Trailway by the Future Center Trust meet the criteria that these investors might be looking for? I wonder if you have personal opinions on that. And then these were four things I threw at you. To pick one, and then we'll close.
One of the challenges we have on the investment side is our investments are, so there's $1 trillion out there saying they want to invest, but they want big projects because they don't want 10,000 tiny projects which they have to monitor. So what we need to do is find people who will gather these projects together, these small projects, into one group of projects, one fund, and be able to commit to the international investors that all of the projects here meet a sustainability criteria and you can invest in them all together. So we need local people who will monitor, collect, and vouch for the credibility of these investments, and then go to the outside world. Our traditional investments are too small to be able to tap in to the international investors. So we need to find an intermediary. One of the things we miss in the Caribbean is we miss intermediaries, people who will say, well, there are savers out there who want to invest in things. They are investment opportunities, but they're not packaged in the right way. They're not the right size. They're not diverse enough, and I will package them together and sell a diversified fund of sustainable investments to the world.
And how do we get these intermediaries? Since you work with government, how do we promote the use of or the creation of these intermediaries?
Well, we can start auctioning off the right to manage some government pension fund money, social security money, to private investors who will do that. We can also make it attractive for them, and so make them get an automatic passport that if they commit to only investing and collecting sustainable projects into that fund, that fund can be invested and can have savings from all over the region. Now, many of our countries allow that anyway, but it would be great to have a single CARICOM passport for those funds. And that would make, I think, people interested in setting up these funds.
So a CIP gone Caribbean wide. that would be interesting. Listen, Avi, it's been a wonderful hour picking your brain. The provocative title did not disappoint. I think I came here expecting to be talking about one little part of the financing of climate change. We ended up spanning government approaches, regional approaches, sort of challenging the traditional ways we approach it. Lots of food for thought. Lots of controversial statements made. I think the audience was quite entranced because we're still here at 60, 65 people at its height, and most people are still here. So on behalf of the Sridhar Ramphal Center, let me thank you very much for your time and for your energy and for your very deep thinking on some of these issues. We're getting some great feedback from the audience. We will have you back, I'm sure. I want to thank Sam Eugene, as usual, for his help in putting all this together from the IT perspective, the team at the SRC for their usual support, and most of all, the audience for making this a wonderful hour of fodder for your lunchtime thinking. So thank you all again. We will be back again in the coming month for another one of these SRC Lunchtime Chats. And I wish you, Avi, and the rest of the audience a wonderful evening or afternoon. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Keep up the great work, Genevieve.
Thank you. And just for those who are asking, the recording will be available on our SRC website and on our social media platforms, including LinkedIn, Instagram, as well as the Facebook account. Thank you so much.
Okay, gotta go. Take care.
Bye-bye.